So by now, I think most of you have probably heard of the Scandinavian airline advertisement. I know Ramsey Paul did a video about it. I see Revenge of the Sis covered it as well. And I'm not going to play it, but I just want to talk a little bit about it because I think that a few points have been missed. Um, it's almost got cliche at this point to point out that white people are the only people that can't celebrate their culture. And oftentimes you get this argument, which, we're accused of being conspiracy theorists by the left for saying this, but they will say, well, you can celebrate your culture, but you have to do it on a national basis. You can celebrate your heritage if you're Celtic or if you're Irish or Italian or Germanic or English. But white isn't a culture. It's not a group of people in that same way. Now that's ridiculous for obvious reasons. But in this case, it's not even that they're attacking white people in general. They've zeroed in on a culture. They've zeroed in on Scandinavian people themselves. So you can't even say that this is an attack on a broad category that's totally invalid. This is an attack on a culture, on one specific culture. And nothing about it was new to me. This deconstructionism has been around for a long time. They of course say that Scandinavian culture, it's invalid because so many other peoples have contributed to the same things that make up Scandinavian culture, and therefore, which is not entirely true. But even if it were true, who gives a shit? You know what I mean? This can be applied to literally any culture on Earth, and that should be obvious. And it will be applied to every culture on Earth. This goes back to what people like Oswald Mosley said almost 100 years ago, that multiculturalism, or multiracialism as they called it at that point, is not multicultural, it's anti-cultural. It's anti-racial. And they've sort of discarded the anti-racial term for obvious reasons. You can't say we are multiracial when you are advocating for the mixture of races, because that will obviously lead to the destruction of the idea of race if everyone's mixed together. And the same goes for culture. Ryan Dawson on Twitter said culture and race are not the same thing. And I said, well, where does culture come from? And his response was, well, it comes from separation and linguistic differences. But of course, where do those things come from, right? Language comes from separation. The reason why different people develop different dialects is because they are separate and they're not communicating with people of other dialects around them. And the same goes for race. The reason why different species of animal exist, or I shouldn't say species, the reason speciation exists, the reason why you have different types of tortoises and deer and such, is largely because of separation. These different groups will separate from the norm, from the herd, from the general area, and then certain mutations cultivate in those newly formed gene pools separate from the former, and that's how you get different subspecies. And that's really how race works. I mean, every difference between the races can be chalked up in some manner or another to environment. Even from IQ to muscle and bone structure to melanin to you fucking name it, right? So these things are not separate. Obviously they're not separate. But people like this, they don't want to admit that. And the irony of all of that is that they're saying it's okay to be protective of your culture but not your race. Of course, Ryan, if you actually look at his videos, he did a scathing video lambasting Gavin McInnes for slandering Native Americans. So he doesn't like you talking about his race in a negative light. But for everyone else, who cares, right? White people, who cares? You're dumb for being racialist. But it is sort of an environmental supremacist ideology. You're saying it's okay to care about culture but not race, even though they come from the same influences, the same separation. But that's sort of getting off track. My point is, this is telling of the future. This is telling of what's coming down the pipe for all of us. And also, nobody seems to be pointing out although it has been said in other cases, this flies in the face of libertarian theories of economics as well. Where is the monetary incentive, the profit motive for doing this? Where's the profit motive for telling people that the place that you want them to go to, that you want them to use your airline to fly to, is not special in the least and has no culture? What is the point of that? And the only reason I can think that they would shoot back with is maybe this is a publicity stunt. But even if that were the case, it's the equivalent of punching an Asian doctor and throwing him off a plane. Excuse me. It's the equivalent of punching an Asian doctor and throwing him off a plane. In terms of like publicity, it's not going to bring anyone to your side. I think it's more likely that you get too many of these woke assholes in the boardroom, and this is what they come up with because they think that everyone's like them. But yeah, I mean, it's an attack on culture, obviously, and you can shirk it off by saying it's just one ad. But how many times can they say that? How many times are they going to say it's just one? It's just one time, you know? How many times can you compartmentalize this? Eventually there's going to come a point where everyone's going to have to recognize this trend. And you're going to have to recognize who's behind it. I haven't looked into who produced this ad. I know Ramsey Paul suggested maybe there's a Burger Stein behind it. And I wouldn't be surprised, but I wouldn't count on that either. There's so many self-hating whites now that you really don't even know. It's really sad, but yeah, I think this is indicative of what they want, of the hellscape they want to create, mixing all the little peoples of the world, so that everyone will be gray just like them, you know, just as Mosley said. And this is why people like that of that era are so useful to show people, because you can draw such stunning parallels between what they said 80 years ago and what's happening today. How can you deny that these great fascist leaders were right if what they said came true in an almost inexplicable way? How could they have possibly foreseen this to this degree? How could you say multiculturalism, multiracialism is anti-culture and anti-racial? How could they predict that if you take people from all over the world and put them in one metropolitan area, you wouldn't get people of every culture mixed together? Well, it's because for most of the time, I mean, you can say that black people in America have their own culture, and that's true. But that's developed over many years, right? But most of the time, if you immigrate to another part of the world, you tend to try to fit in with that culture, right? And that's because that culture dominates that area, dominates that region or that society. It dominates that region or that society. And so you want to fit in, you want to be part of that dominant culture. But as European influence over culture is diminished, there's no reason for these people to want to be like us. There's no reason for them to want to be European. Instead, what dominates their surroundings is the metropolitan culture. And we know who decides that, don't we? A capitalist, hyper-mercantile culture that it's basically, you know, Amazon and McDonald's. It's you know, hipster culture. That's what dominates these areas. And it has the capacity to take a culturally conservative Muslim and turn him into a hipster. It has the capacity to subjugate everyone from all over the world under this soulless, just crushing abomination, this monstrosity of a non-culture that really encapsulates urbanite life now. And you know, I'll kvetch about being from a small town, but there are so many. When I go to a big city, every single time, and it doesn't seem to matter what city it is, whenever I go to a big city, I just look around. I just look around at the people, the fucking abominations. The other day, I was at a city nearby, and I see this morbidly obese, like 350, 400 pound guy with fucking elf ears on. I see this fat couple in Iron Man hoodies with backpacks on in their 30s. All of these like weirdos, like guys with a skinny little nerdy looking guy with a pink bowl cut who smelled awful. And it's not just one or two. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. Normal people are not even the norm in these places a lot of the time. It's fucking sick. It's fucking sick. And this is what we have to look forward to. This is what happens when you break down masculinity, when you break down Western civilization. This is what you get. And we have to make that clear, I think, because I think that most people who advocate this sort of thing, these sort of leftists, they don't understand it. They don't see what's coming down the pipe. And, the sort of UNICEF style future that they imagine for a multicultural society is simply unrealistic. And they're not going to get it until it's too late. So, we have to protect Scandinavian culture. We have to protect all cultures. And we have to make it clear that this is a movement, not just for our identity, but for the concept of identity itself, because that's what we're fighting for. Even when the white man is gone, this isn't going to stop. Everyone in the world is going to be crushed by this, and that needs to be made known. So thank you for listening. Good night.